Thank you very much indeed. Mr. President, Excellency, distinguished academicians, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the Pontifical Academy of Sciences for its invitation to take part in this seminar on the subject COVID-19, new insights on causes, actions and consequences of the pandemic and implications for science and health policy. It provides us with an opportunity to take stock of lessons learned and to reflect on their implications for new scientific agendas, but also for science and healthcare policies that can serve large numbers of people and prove inclusive of the poorer segments of societies. We can hardly approach the question of a global restart without making at least some reference to our shared experience of the past year and a half. Our own individual experiences and reflections, as well as from the standpoint of this Academy, the significant scientific advances made in response to the pandemic. For this reason, reflection on the scientific aspects of the pandemic and its implications in the field of inclusive health policies should have as its starting point human dignity, the dignity that makes men and women unique and determines their place in this world. At the same time, serious efforts to restart may not prescind from a deeper search for wisdom and truth. Is this a legitimate way of approaching the experience of the past year and what it portends for the future? An answer to this question can come from Dante Alighieri, the great poet. In this last year, when we commemorate the 700th anniversary of his death. In his letter to the Congrande della Scala, Dante stated that his purpose in writing the Divine Comedy was to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of happiness. This same concern has always guided the Church, not only in Dante's century, when Europe, devastated by violence and plague, despaired of the future, but in our own time as well. Today, in fact, we find ourselves in a similar situation. Despite countless life-saving advances in science and medical care, humanity still seems adrift. Yet, from that distant past, we can find a starting point for a participatory, inclusive, and constructive approach to the restart we need today. When in the 14th century, Florentine merchants invented double-entry accounting ledgers, the basis of modern accounting procedures, they always apportioned a share of the annual income to a certain Messer Domini Deo. God, in other words, was entitled to a share in the profits, but his share went to the needy, the poor and the sick. Perhaps something similar can encourage our own efforts at a restart, inspired by what Pope Francis likes to call an attentive gaze. Again, in his words, certainly, there is a need to find the resources and the means to get society back in motion. But what is needed above all are people who have the courage to say, I, in a spirit of responsibility and not selfishness, and make it clear by their own lives that we can greet each day with confidence and hope. End of quotation. In today's world, still suffering the effects of the pandemic, we have seen two opposed tendencies emerged. The first insists on the principle of solidarity and inclusivity as alone capable of advancing the good of the entire human family. Pope Francis consistently reaffirms the importance of this principle. He speaks of it frequently and identifies it with the category of closeness. The second tendency, however, is seldom stated explicitly, but operates in subtle ways. It is careful not to criticize the principle of solidarity, but insists on how difficult it is to apply and questions whether objectively divergent health interests can actually be reconciled on a global level. Behind this tendency, we seem to hear an echo of the ancient and cruel dictum, mors tua vita mea, your death is my life. The idea that the world can come together in the name of a global and inclusive health solidarity would seem to be, for those who succumb to the perverse fascination of this second tendency, an idealistic but ultimately unrealistic illusion. So the question arises, what kind of future awaits us? During the lockdown, each of us had opportunities for more quiet time to think, read, and reflect. At one point, I came across an article written a few years ago which presented the space of experience and the horizon of expectation as guides to interpreting the relationship between past, present, and future. It led me to reflect on how these two realities, experience and expectation, can help us interpret our present situation. The horizon of expectation and the space of experience are complementary concepts. These two categories help establish the possibility of a history, since there is no history that is not shaped by the experience and expectations of men and women in as much as they act and are acted upon. The notions of horizon of expectation and space of experience were developed in a study by Reinhard Kolczek, which analyzed the distinction between past and future. Kolczek states that our representations of time are always oriented from the present to the past, or from the present to the future. Expectations envision a future that is the product of the configuration of both individual and collective experiences. No expectations without experience, no experience without expectation. Space of experience needs to be considered in relation, not in opposition, to a horizon of expectation. Experience and expectation disclose the ethical and political significance of the representation of time for those who act within it. In this age of COVID, most people's horizon of expectation appears concerned with day-to-day life and realities close at hand. It seems tinged with a certain anxiety and a troubling sense that the future gives little cause for optimism. That is why it is essential to forge a new alliance between science and humanism. The two should be integrated, not separated, or even worse, opposed. For on them depend the health and the economic and social development of our community. With regard to this last point, I might add that the development of a global community of fraternity based on the practice of social friendship on the part of peoples and nations calls for a better kind of politics, one truly at the service of the common good. And that's a quotation from Fratelli Tutti. Among the certitudes present on the horizon of expectations, in the popular mind, there remains the belief that progress, particularly scientific and technological progress, continues to have much to offer us, as well as the belief that human beings can still, for better or worse, play an active and conscious role in history. To understand how these two beliefs can inspire greater inclusivity in our efforts to restart, I would quote from a letter written to Goethe in 1820 by one of his correspondents, Graf Reinhardt, following the outbreak of revolution in Spain. "You are surely correct, my distinguished friend, in what you say about experience. For individuals, it comes always too late, while for governments and people, it never comes at all. This is because past experience presents itself as a single focal point, whereas present experience stretches out for minutes, hours, days, years, and centuries." The COVID-19 pandemic can represent a true moment of conversion, not only in the spiritual sense. That is a real opportunity for change, yet it could also be a cause for regression, a retreat into individualism and exploitation. Our response to COVID-19 can indeed spark a resumption and restart inspired by hope that humanity at the beginning of the 21st century can be remembered for having generously assumed its grave responsibilities. We are faced with a great cultural challenge to promote the common good and a change of perspective that sets human dignity at the center of all our actions. In light of what I've said so far, we can begin to discern some principles to guide the creation of more inclusive healthcare policies, whose goal would be a recovery of the centrality of the human person and the duty to respect the dignity of each individual. Such policies should develop in consideration of three needs. One, we need the light of hope, As we read in the encyclical letter Lumen Fidei, the light that comes from faith, from God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ and in his Spirit, the light that illumines all reality and helps us to realize that it bears the indelible mark of God's loving plan, this in turn awakens the hope that is at the basis of every human action, every attempt to improve the world around us. Truth is closely connected to the hope that today's world desperately needs if it is to emerge better from the COVID-19 crisis. 2, we need justice. As we read in the encyclical letter Laudato Si, the Holy Father, rejecting all partial visions, proposes a holistic, global, and expansive view of creation, seen as a common home, a living environment, and not simply as an object there for our use. The universe thus appears as a place where multiplicity and variety abound and where everything is related, united by invisible bonds, connected. Our world is a network of relationships. That is why Pope Francis has proposed a number of guidelines for human development inspired by the treasury of Christian spiritual experience. The Holy Father is convinced that change is impossible without motivation and a process of education. 3, we need fraternity. As we read in the encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, fraternity is no mere emotion, feeling, or ideal, however noble, but a factual datum that entails effort, action, and personal freedom. While solidarity is the principle of social planning that allows the unequal to become equal, fraternity is what allows the equal to be different people. Fratelli Tutti begins by evoking a fraternal openness by which we can acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person regardless of physical proximity, regardless of where he or she was born or lives. Contrary to what the pandemic might appear to indicate, others are not threats, but gifts, brothers and sisters, companions on our journey. None of us can fail to ask at this historical juncture if our responses to the pandemic, whether scientific, political, or spiritual, are truly helping our world to make progress towards the supreme good of human fraternity. Indeed, we may have to ask whether the material evil of the pandemic has actually favored rather than hindered the spread of the social evil of selfishness. If that is the case, let us hope that if we want to preserve a minimum of human dignity, we will find the moral resources needed to see and to help others to see those around us as brothers and sisters. The horizon of expectation within which we can situate the restart we all desire, and the space of experience in which we can situate communities and individuals are interconnected in the decision that need to be made vis-a-vis the recovery plan and healthcare policies. There is a need, in other words, to rethink the very concept of progress, passing from limited, unilateral, and unidirectional models of growth to the promotion of new and inclusive social and political bounds. Bonds that embody the truth that each human person is an end in himself or herself, and never simply a means to be valued only for his or her usefulness. Persons are created to live together in families, communities, and societies, where all are equal in dignity. Human rights derive from this dignity, as do human duties, like the responsibility to welcome and assist the poor, the sick, and the excluded. In a word, we can see as one feature of the cluster of epochal changes set in motion by the COVID-19 pandemic, the genesis of a conception of the political and social order that is more respectful of the dignity of each person. We are coming to realize that we are living in new times with changing expectations as a new variable enters into every decision, namely if and when the pandemic permits. I would like to conclude by quoting once again Pope Francis, who in speaking to the Pontifical Academy for Life last 27th of September, pointed to reasons for hope. In his words, the crisis of the pandemic has highlighted the profound interdependentness existing between ourselves, the human family, and our common home. Our societies, especially in the West, have tended to forget this interconnection. the bitter consequences are before our eyes. It is thus urgent in this time of epochal change to invert this human tendency. This we can do through a synergy among different disciplines, drawing upon the contributions of biology and hygiene, medicine and epidemiology, economics, sociology, anthropology, and ecology. In addition to the analysis of data, there is a need to identify technological, political, and ethical criteria of action with regard to health systems, the family, employment, and the environment. In fact, the risk of new pandemics will continue to be a threat also for the future. Thank you very much for your kind attention.